good afternoon, and
Good evening.
welcome to R.W.A. Radicals with Age. My name is Jesse.
And my name is Pancho.
Today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024. And since we are just a few months away from resuming a Trump presidency,
Oh,
and when I'm taking a break from doing that and crying and screaming and maybe both at the same time, I've been thinking a lot about how conservatives in general, but not strictly conservatives, manipulate language. It is interesting. I don't know if I quite subscribe to this, but there are people who say the reason it's called spelling is because anytime you speak, you are doing magic. You are casting spells into the world. And in a non supernatural way, I do believe that. I do daily affirmations. I love the movie, and I just rewatched it, The Help, where the protagonist has the white children that he's watching say to themselves, "You is kind, you is smart, and you is important." I do think there is a lot of power in language, just not in some spooky supernatural way. I started to make a list of words or phrases that, let's not even say conservatives, let's say that the political establishment, the mainstream, has manipulated and weaponized in order to do a number of things depending on the phrase. But mainly, I'd say it is to instill fear in people and to use certain words and to repeat them over and over in order to, yes, again, instill fear. And I just thought of another one, which is why I paused. I'm going to add to this list. I don't have terrorism. I think that one goes without saying, right? That before the war in Iraq, we had wars against countries or against dictators. And then all of a sudden we had this war on terror, the war on drugs, these sort of, and especially the war on terror, like, what is terror? How are we going and fighting terror? It all of a sudden you can label anyone a terrorist and then have a war against anybody. And how terrifying is that? That terror is just around everywhere. Marxism and socialism, which are often meant to be the same thing, and communism, also not on my list, but certainly should be. Those three terms get interchanged. They do not mean the same thing. We've spent some time talking about all three, particularly Marxism and socialism. Yeah, they are just all used as these words to essentially mean slavery, right? If we had a Marxist or socialist system according to this establishment, then we would be enslaved to the regimes that install these systems rather than the actual definition of these words, which are anything but slavery. We also have phrases like Obamacare, affirmative action, an affirmative action hire, a race card or a race quota, reverse racism, which we've discussed slightly. I think my dad, helped us define that anybody can have prejudice against somebody else. I might have a bias against white people, which I do, but without a power structure behind it, behind that bias or that bigotry or that prejudice, you don't have racism. And so we broke it down, whichever episode that we did, that most times that's going to mean, certainly in this country and in this system, that white people have the power and can therefore be racist. But there are spheres and areas where non-white folks are in power and can therefore discriminate and use that power to be racist. Reverse racism is often just used that, like, because affirmative action happens, there's reverse racism against white people, which I think is made up. A couple more. Welfare queen, which I've been thinking a lot about recently. I just don't understand how that one has even come into the lexicon. How people get in their minds this idea that there is some single black mother in the hood who is collecting welfare with her kids and is just living some amazing life because she is collecting welfare. I just think that that is wholly absurd. And if you ever actually thought about this, you would never aspire to be a welfare queen. And the last one being patriotism. Again, not just the general definition of the word patriotism, but how, in this case, often conservatives co-opt patriotism in order to create this false dichotomy where I am patriotic because I love America, And if you are protesting something that the American government does, you are therefore not patriotic and therefore a horrible person. And finally, there's a somewhat new dog whistle or manipulation of language, which is the theme of our episode this week, and that is CRT, critical race theory. And I know from experience that many individuals in our country and culture have no idea what this means. So CRT has recently become this huge catch-all to mean really anything that has anything to do with race. That's CRT. That's bad. And fortunately, I am once again joined by the greatest English professor of all time, who is here to break down for us not only the meaning of CRT, but its history, the pioneers and inventors of this term, and probably a lot more great stuff. So, Dad, I'm going to turn the spotlight over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you kindly. To quote Charles Mingus. First thing I will say is I liked how you sort of framed this by talking about language. And that reminds me of the famous quote from one of my intellectual heroes, Socrates. And the quote goes, "The misuse of language induces evil in the soul." So all of the terms that you used were misuses of language that various people on the right have used to manipulate and influence people's opinions about various issues, most of which have to do with race. On the specific topic of critical race theory, what I can say is that people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida,
Your boy.
my boy, one of my many boys. Did you know I have many boys?
Yes, and not just the three sons that you have, but you have many,
True.
many boys and girls.
And unfortunately, too many of my boys have not become men.
Mm.
And Ron DeSantis is one of them. So, as you just correctly said, he has used critical race theory as a kind of blanket term for teaching really anything about Black history in schools. And in particular, the problem is that teaching Black history, according to him, is going to make white people feel overly painful and guilty. And we don't want to do anything that's going to make people feel pain. Therefore, if we, for example, talked about slavery and the history of slavery in the classroom and the fact that the Civil War was not about states' rights, it was about slavery, or you could say states' rights to maintain the institution of slavery, that's going to make white kids in the classroom feel guilty. Therefore, we can't teach an accurate history of the Civil War. But to get back to the topic of language, he incorrectly used critical race theory as a catch-all for all of that kind of stuff. The fact of the matter is that critical race theory is a theory that was exclusively rooted in the law. It was a term that was invented by lawyers for lawyers. Didn't really have anything to do with teaching elementary school children about the history of the Civil War in Florida schools. So critical race theory began basically in the 1970s. The basic premise of it was that race is central to the law and the policy of the United States. Furthermore, it said that racism is not, and this is a big deal, that racism is not a form of ignorance. For a long time, people believed that racism was a form of ignorance, and all you had to do was educate people to the right thing, and then they would stop being racist. But critical race theory said that race is at the foundation of American policy, American society, American law. And again, that racism is not a matter of bad thinking that can be cured. It's deeply embedded in the American system. Go
Exactly, and
ahead.
it was a response to the already existing critical theory. I sort of see it as like a sociological read of things that you have to look at the overarching systems, and rather than blaming individuals, trying to look at the circumstances that led to them to various positions and circumstances. Adding race to that, adding it to the equation, was of course very important when you have, as I'm sure everybody listening to this knows, race, to quote your brother, not just your boy, but your brother, race matters.
Ha ha ha.
Dr. Cornell West, if anyone's not familiar. Very good book, Race Matters.
Yes, I have taught it. So, another essential feature of critical race theory is the notion that civil rights gains don't happen primarily because of the benefit that is going to come to Black people, but in fact, because of the benefit that is going to come to white people. One of the godfathers of critical race theory is one of my intellectual heroes, Derek Bell. And Derek Bell wrote this very famous law article about the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And what he pointed out was that the Warren Court did not just decide the Brown decision because they cared about what was happening to Black people. It was more a political decision. Specifically, in the 1950s, the Cold War was happening, and the Soviet Union was using the issue of race relations in the United States as a form of propaganda. Specifically, how can the United States call itself this great country of democracy when the Klan is alive and well, Black folks are getting lynched, people who fought for democracy in World War II then come home and get discriminated against, you know, the
Can't vote.
US and can't vote, et cetera, et cetera. So that political reality was behind the Brown v. Board decision. And so what that decision did, again, this is Derek Bell's argument, what this decision did was to make the U.S. look better on the world front. And in addition to the Brown decision, the United States State Department organized all these tours for jazz musicians to go around the world and play. And that was supposed to be another sign of the Soviet propaganda that we're racist. This would go against that. We have the Brown decision, and we have Black musicians traveling around the world. And those two things show that, in fact, we are an equal opportunity country, and therefore Soviet propaganda about us being racist is, in fact, not true, even though it was.
Mm.
Speaking of Derek Bell, I don't know if everybody knows who Derek Bell was. Derek Bell was a civil rights lawyer for the first half of his career. And in the second half of his career, he was a academic, a legal academic. He was dean of the law school at the University of Oregon. He resigned from that position because the University of Oregon refused to hire an Asian woman in law school whom he wanted to hire. He also taught at Harvard, and he ended up resigning from his position at Harvard for the same reason that Harvard wouldn't hire a tenured Black woman in the law school. Interesting aside, Derek Bell grew up in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, which is the exact same district that Augustine grew up in, and all of his plays are about. So Derek Bell was the first Black tenured professor at the Harvard Law School. He is considered to be the primary inventor of the concept of critical race theory. So I want to read a quote from Derek Bell, because this quote gets us to the essence of why critical race theory exists in the first place. It is hopeless for the Negro to expect complete emancipation from the menial social and economic position into which the white man has forced him merely by trusting in the moral sense of the white race. However large the number of individual white men who do and who will identify themselves completely with the Negro cause, the white race in America will not admit the Negro to equal rights if it is not forced to do so. Upon that point, one may speak with a dogmatism which all history justifies. In other words, racism is at the center and at the heart of everything in America, including the law. What was important about critical race theory is that the law as a institution was always thought of as being objective. And what critical race theory did was to undermine that idea and to clearly demonstrate that race and racism are at the basis of the American legal system, and therefore that needs to be challenged.
Yeah, if you take these legal things and look at them in a colorblind way, you're going to have all these issues of some of which we've discussed previously, these various colorblind laws that have racist effect, redlining, grandfathering, the list goes on and on. I do want to pause you briefly because you've already talked about it, but if you don't go into it specifically, my favorite thing about Derek Bell, and I do want to go back previously and give my ducks a little bit of a shout out because I learned about critical race theory at the University of Oregon. So although Derek Bell left because of issues that he had with the school being racist, and Oregon is still a very racist state. But fortunately, the ethnic studies department at the University of Oregon is quite good. And one of my intellectual heroes and mentors, Dr. Charisse Cheney, wrote her dissertation about the Brown decision because she is from Topeka, Kansas. And so she did this kind of case study. I think, I want to say it was 20 years, maybe more. Anyway, maybe it's 50 years after the Brown decision, and went and looked at education, that now that you have integrated schools, surely the educational outcomes for Black students will be better. And her paper goes out to prove that, unfortunately, almost the exact opposite is the case, that just because the schools became integrated, it didn't actually mean that educational outcomes got better for Black students. What ended up happening was white flight, where white people moved to better areas, and those schools and school districts became better because of higher property taxes and funding, and the schools that Black and lower income white students were getting pushed into actually ended up suffering more so than they did previously. One of the things I learned and these are 400 level, really, I think one of them I took was 400/500 level. So these are graduate level college courses. This isn't, like you said, this isn't elementary school, this isn't high school, this isn't even college. This is advanced end of your education kind of stuff, or moving on to even higher education to even learn about critical race theory in general. But one of the concepts that I learned and remember very fondly from Derek Bell is exactly what you said, the interest convergence. Your example about Brown or the civil rights movement, that these things didn't happen just because white people decided, oh, it's time for us to be more ethical and give Black people the right to vote. But there was also something that benefited the power structure at B. We can say white people generally, but more specifically, just that the elite in the country, if it didn't benefit them, then they wouldn't be pushing to have these things happen. So just want to interject that in case you didn't get to interest convergence, because it's a very interesting term. And it's one of those things that makes me a little bit pessimistic often. But as we discussed last week, it is okay to not have the optimism of the intellect because we can see so many atrocities happening every day. As long as we don't lose that optimism of the will of knowing that we can fight and make things better. So just want to interject that. Thank you.
Always love it when you refer to my favorite quote by Antonio Gramsci: pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will.
It is, I didn't know it until last week. So that's one of my added bonuses of doing this show, is that I get to learn just as much as our viewers.
I totally agree with what you said about interest convergence, and that was precisely what was happening with the Brown decision, that it was a benefit to white people. And that's the point, that white people are only going to make decisions in favor of black people if white people actually are the beneficiaries as well. In the Brown case, yeah, black people got integrated schools, which I'll come back to in a second, and white people got the image of America during the Cold War improved.
I just love too, another really good example is the Emancipation Proclamation. People love to look at that and say, look, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, forgetting one, he only freed the slaves in the Confederacy, and then two, that then we have the 13th Amendment, which gives this loophole that slavery is illegal unless it's for the punishment of a crime. So, of course, Michelle Alexander has done incredible work in the new Jim Crow, discussing how we did sort of put it into law, but also gave this loophole that got very much used. The literal invention, not invention, but inception of police forces in the United States came right after the Civil War, in order to, all of these previous like slave catchers went from being slave catchers and plantation owners to now being police officers and prison wardens, to arrest black people for things as simple as jaywalking and cussing on the street, or drinking out of the wrong water fountain, or going to the wrong bathroom. And by wrong, if you're not aware, it means ones that were for whites only, therefore arresting people and then putting them right back into slavery. Yeah, I think that's just another good example of interest convergence, that this was not just about freeing the slaves, and that there was very intentional things that were done to, of course, continue to benefit the elite.
They often use the term vagrancy
Mm.
as a kind of catch-all phrase for anything they decided that black people were doing that they shouldn't be doing.
Emmett Till whistling at a woman, at a white woman, for example.
Exactly. I don't know if you know this, remember this, but in 2016, I actually taught a course on critical race theory. I just found the description I had to write to go into the course catalog, so I thought I would read that.
Cool.
Critical race theory began as a movement in the 1970s, primarily fueled by those in the legal profession who came to the conclusion that the gains of the civil rights era had either stalled or were being rolled back, and that too often the legal profession was complicit in upholding white supremacy and the hierarchies of gender, class, and sexual orientation. Critical race theory thus attempted to reinterpret and remake the world, to reveal silenced suffering, and to relieve social misery. Critical race theorists responded to the, quote, objective, unquote, notion of law by positing that race needed to be challenged and race needed to be brought to the center of any analysis, and that the notion of a colorblind society needed to be challenged and constantly fought against. One of the ways they did this was by abandoning traditional legal objective language and instead writing from a subjective perspective, using storytelling parables, and autobiography to confront what Derek Bell has called, quote, the permanence of racism, unquote, and arguing that pedagogy, scholarship, and struggle are intimately connected. We will read works by Derek Bell, Patricia Williams, Michelle Alexander, Lonnie Guinier, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Brian Stevens.
Nice. And I only know a few of those names, not all of them. So I love that there's some more homework for me to do as well. But I think Kimberly Crenshaw is a good direction to go into because we haven't touched on specifically on intersectionality yet, which is another huge piece to the CRT puzzle. I will start by saying that she is famous for, is it Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, I believe, which is her sort of intro into this. And it's kind of like one of those psychological, like personality tests that you can take where I think it's something like 50 different questions. And it's a way to check your privilege. And the more of these things that exist in your life, then the more privilege you have. And therefore, the system benefits you more versus those of you who, spoiler alert, are Black or what do we say, historically oppressed peoples, whether it's a person of color, whether it's being a woman, whether it's being a member of the LGBTQIA2 plus community. Look at that. I got that off pretty seamlessly. And the quick breakdown of intersectionality, right? If we the example I learned about was with the feminist movement, that the original feminist movement was saying, hey, there are all these issues that women face. Great, we need to address those issues. However, the experience of a white woman, especially at this time, was not at all the same as a Black woman. And if you don't look at the ways in which race and sex, in this case, intersect, then you're not getting the full story. Because, of course, to come back to Jim Crow, white women, yeah, maybe for a while they weren't able to vote either, but they could drink at the right water fountain. They could marry, white men. They could not own property yet, but didn't have any fear about like becoming a slave or being, kidnapped and forced into solitude and stuff. And so there were big issues with the feminist movement. I think what became the second or maybe even the third wave of the feminist movement, which was to really incorporate the experience of Black women and saying, hey, if you're not taking into the account the experience of Black women, then this feminist movement isn't going to go very far.
In other words, to put it a little more bluntly, Black women said, we get fucked over because we're women, but we also get fucked over because we're Black.
Exactly.
And therefore, because we're Black women, in many ways, we get fucked over more than anybody does.
Right.
And people need to understand from the two different perspectives, race and gender, how we are being screwed over by society.
And of course, class as well. This is one that I get into an argument with lower income white folks who say, hey, I grew up poor. I didn't have access to good education. My parents didn't have good jobs, so I couldn't get a one up in that way. I didn't have a job waiting for me when I finished high school or whatever it might be. Yes, absolutely. As a poor white person, and in my case, this was poor white men I was talking to. So as poor white men, yes, the system disadvantages you. It's going to be hard to get a job. It actually might, in some places, be really hard to get into college because there are now extra opportunities for students of color to get scholarships and funding to get into school because we've recognized that poor Black people have been so disadvantaged. And there's this generational poverty, whereas for poor white students, yeah, we maybe haven't done enough in that sphere. But to then say, well, just because I'm a poor white person, therefore I have the same experience as a Black person is obviously missing the point. You can still be oppressed, but you have to look at the intersections of these things, not just class, but race, but gender, etc.
And just as a footnote, the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And when I am president of the United States, I will appoint Kimberly Crenshaw to the Supreme Court.
Ooh, well, there you go.
She
You're
will she will be my first selection.
and you're a little bit young right now to be president based on our recent history, but in 4 years you'll be getting pretty close.
I'm still a spring chicken.
Right. As far as the last couple of presidents are concerned, you are.
Exactly. So Kimberly Crenshaw will be my first choice.
So here's a question for you, which can maybe help hammer in this point a little bit more. Do you think, firstly, part one, do you think Ron DeSantis, that miserable prick, even has any idea what critical race theory is, or has he just heard those words and because race is in it, has now done that catch-all blanket thing? And then the sort of part two is how has this been so successful that we have been able to convince people across the country that it's better to ban books that have instances of race and racism and violence, you know, representations of queer people, etc. I thought the Republicans were the party of free speech, and yet they're banning all these books. So what do you have to say about that?
In response to the first part of your question, I don't think Ron DeSantis is smart enough to understand what critical race theory really means. I believe he did go to law school, but his legal knowledge is clearly lacking.
Yeah, I think he got his law degree from Trump University, or maybe PragerU, or maybe Apollo College or something.
Hmm. Someplace like that. As to your second part of the question, I mean, this is what critical race theory is about. At its bottom is that everything in America is about race. This is part of the reason why Trump got reelected. People are willing to overlook all the terrible things that he has said and done because he is the best spokesperson for white supremacy. There's good people on both sides. I
Right,
want you to remember that.
right,
White people realize that people of color are going and in some places have already become the largest proportion of the population. And white people are scared and uptight. They realize on some deeper level all the shit that they have done to people of color. And they are afraid that when people of color become the majority, they're going to turn the tables and do to them what they did to us.
mm,
And so they will vote for a white person, despite, in Trump's case, all the horrible things he has said and done. It's all about race. And that is, again, that is the bottom line of critical race theory, that race is at the essence of everything there is about America, because we were founded on the institution of slavery.
right. And a couple of interesting responses to that. Firstly, it's really interesting to look at the history of whiteness. And I'm going to come back to a question about that at the end. But firstly, who has been white in the United States has not always been the same. In fact, it has been an ever evolving thing. An easy example I'm sure people know about, maybe they don't know the legal reality, but that Irish people and Italian people were not white for quite some time. They weren't black, they weren't slaves, but they were not white Anglo-Saxon WASP, Saxon Protestants or whatever. And so they did not get the same treatment by the law that traditional white people did.
No dogs are Irish allowed.
Right, exactly. So a point came in which they got pulled into whiteness, and then it's really the sad thing where you have now Irish people saying, "Well, we were oppressed, and so we understand," but then at the same time, well, now we're white, and so we don't really care about the struggles of other folks. unfortunately sort of similar to what we're seeing happening in the Middle East, that you have people who are descendants of the atrocities of Hitler's regime in World War II and concentration camps, deeply, deeply oppressed. But now, just a couple of generations later, you have the descendants of those people carrying out a genocide in Palestine and the West Bank, etc. For anyone here maybe saying, well, you guys are starting to sound a little biased against white people. Can't just be white people. And first of all, you are right. You do not have to be white to participate in white supremacy. Look at Candace Owens or Jesse Lee Peterson, who unfortunately shares my name. That guy who ran for the Senate, I think, in North Carolina, who talked about how he would love to have slaves if he could, despite being a black man himself. So you don't just have to.
He called himself the Black Nazi.
Right. Oh my God, I didn't even know that. Yikes. Um, so again, you don't have to have white skin to participate in the system that is white supremacy. However, when we look at the election results, white people sure did overwhelmingly vote for Trump, especially white women. But another big demographic, which comes back to the beginning of this tangent I had, is that Latino men overwhelmingly voted for Trump. And there's this interesting thing that I've heard about that takes place in Latino countries where you have a sort of different racial system where you have sort of three races where you have, I think this is blancos, white people, people who are descendants of Europeans. Then you have mestizos, people who are mixed, if you're not aware of that, Europeans who then had sex with the indigenous people there and created this sort of second group of people. And then you have the actual indigenous, which I would just say black people, right? Indigenous people of Mexico or Central America, as well as slaves that were brought there. Not tons brought to Mexico, but certainly places like Brazil, you have a similar thing where you have the Portuguese, the mestizos, and the African slaves that existed there. And so to bring it back as a question to you, Dad, do you think there is a connection here between certain Latino men kind of aspiring to whiteness and that they, in such large numbers voted for Trump?
In a word, yes. So, to go back to your previous point, this is one of my pet peeves about racial designations that are made. You are correct that in the Latin American world, there are three kinds of people. There are white people, there are mixed people, and there are indigenous people. This is the difference between the terms Hispanic and Latino. In order to be Latino, you have to have black or indigenous blood. Hispanic means you're white and you speak Spanish. I have always found it incredibly problematic that we list Hispanics, white people who speak Spanish, we list them as a minority. We don't list white people who speak French as a minority. We don't classify white people who speak Polish as some minority. People vote out of their interests, and people will always continue to do that. And so I think that there is often, in fact, a distinction between the views of Hispanics and the views of Latinos.
Mm.
Therefore, politicians and pundits are incorrect to use a term like Hispanic, the Hispanic vote, because they mean all people who speak Spanish. And that is just an incorrect way to classify people. So, to get more specific, I have seen all kinds of polls where people from Mexico, for example, are asked the question, when ICE comes for people, are you going to feel uptight? And a significant number of them say no,
Mm.
because I'm an American citizen. I came here, quote unquote, legally, and I want those people who have come here quote unquote, illegally to not be treated the same way that I was treated. And so I'm all for policies like Trump's of closing down the border. And I'm sure we've said this before, but it's always worth repeating. Nobody asks the radical question. Radical meaning getting down to the root. Why are these people coming here in the first place? They're not coming here because they want to come to the United States. They're coming here because of the shitty conditions in their home countries. And if we want to stop people from coming, quote unquote, what we should do is help the political and economic situations in the countries from which they are from.
Exactly. And I'd love to take this opportunity to show the viewers why I have a turtle in the set. This is something that I borrowed from Dr. Robert Sapolsky of that shit-ass school that you attended, Stanford University, where
I don't even know where that is.
has it been
I
that
mean,
long?
well, yeah, but Rachel Maddow went there.
She
Tiger
did.
Woods, yeah, Tiger Woods went there. I mean,
Your own son went there.
my own son went there. I mean,
Not me.
I don't know why people would attend that place.
Well, I don't know why either, unless they're going to get into behavioral biology, because Dr. Sapolsky is the man. And in his book, Determined, which I speak quite a bit about in episode 4, he starts the book with this old myth that I have researched and have not been able to find where it came from. But the myth goes like this: before, ancient peoples knew about gravity and how the universe worked, as if we know how the universe works now. Of course we don't, but we know some of the mechanisms, right? But previously, people did not understand how the Earth could just be floating around in space. And if they didn't know about gravity, like, how is this thing just in space? And so the idea was that the Earth was sitting on top of a turtle. But then, of course, the question becomes, what is that turtle on? That turtle just can't be floating anywhere. And so that turtle is on top of another turtle. And this is the idea of an infinite regress, that it's turtles all the way down. You can never actually get to the full route because it would take you too far back. And so to bring it back around to what you were saying, I think most times we get stuck talking about not the lowest turtle, but a couple of turtles up. We talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about inequality, we talk about greed. That's a really good one. People like to talk about, capitalism isn't the problem. It's just that there's greedy people, and it's not capitalism, it's really crony capitalism that is messing with everything. But I think the bottom turtle for so many of our problems is economic. This scarcity based system, which right now is capitalism, but before that, feudalism and mercantilism and all of those other iterations of it, until we address this root cause out of which everything else is grown out. Racism was not a thing previously. It was invented, and different countries have done it different ways. But to speak about the US, this racial hierarchy system was created in order to justify the institution of slavery. And so, to bring it back to your point, which is exactly spot on, right? People, when they talk about immigration, like to just look at the symptom rather than the root cause. And the root cause in this case is countries not having economic independence, and therefore people struggling to not have the means, and therefore, you know, all of the other social issues, whether it's gangs and violence, trafficking and trading, human trafficking, right? All of these horrible things that are all products of an unstable country economically. And of course, we've done a little bit of talking about how the country responsible for that in most cases is, in fact, the United States, overthrowing rulers, installing our corporations to extract wealth and resources from these countries, leaving these people without much of an option other than to flee, to pack up. And it's one thing, maybe it's one thing if you live in Tijuana and can like see the border. These are people coming from South America, or even or Central America too, but people from South America making this crazy long, intense journey where you pay like all the money you have to get a coyote to help smuggle you or just smuggle your kids across the border, the sexual violence that happens in these spaces, to think that people think these people want to do this, that they don't want to stay in their own country, in their own homes, in their own communities. The level of desperation that has to be present in order for people to do this, especially now when you have the commanding Cheeto in chief telling people that if you come over here, you're going to get you're going to get locked up, you're going to get sent back to maybe your country, probably just sent back to Mexico. So now you're in a country that also doesn't have a lot of economic opportunities, but it's not even your own country now. It is just maddening to me. So thank you for letting me go on that tangent about turtles.
Yeah, well, before you went off onto that tangent, I was about to say that there was a problem with this episode that we hadn't talked enough about capitalism.
Always ready to bring you back
But
there.
so it was good that you went there because the whole issue of capitalism is connected to wealth accumulation, it's connected to distributive justice, and it's connected to power. And racism, as we have said, is about power. And that's one of the things that critical race theory was designed to do, was to demonstrate to people that racism and power are at the basis of the American legal system. And it is not this, you know, purely objective thing. It is, in fact, very subjective.
Since we've gotten back to capitalism, how can we? Yeah, this one's hard for me, Dad. Interest convergence and what everything else we've talked about today is one of the things that makes me quite pessimistic, that arguably any stride we make only happens because it benefits the system. I didn't want to say this quote, but now I'm saying it, and I need to find the author of this quote, which is, and I think it's a comedian, but might be Richard Pryor, not sure. White supremacy is like a Cadillac. They got a new version every year, meaning that this thing adapts, right? You don't hear, other than this, DeSantis critical race theory, you don't hear tons of race stuff brought up now, right? It's the dog whistle of immigration or shithole countries or poor people or criminals, right? All these other things that, of course, race is a huge component of. But I think, in the Trump presidency, we'll see if the real fascist stuff comes out. He's talked about just anybody who disagrees with him, right? I now call myself a radical leftist lunatic because that's how he refers to anybody essentially who didn't vote for him. So my question to you is, in an era where, or in a country rather, where all strides for ordinary working people only happen when the elite are also beneficiaries, what is there to be optimistic about?
Good question. So, first thing I want to say is shout out to Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, because part of what you said is precisely the argument that she makes, that first we had slavery, and then slavery ended, and white folks said, well, we basically want to continue slavery, but we can't call it slavery anymore, so we got to come up with something new. And they came up with Jim Crow. And then after the 1954 Brown decision, Jim Crow was gone. And so they said, well, we got to come up with something new. And for Michelle Alexander, that something new was mass incarceration. And so, yes, you are correct that white people, it is in their best interests, according to them, to keep the system of racial oppression going. And when one form of it gets outlawed, they come up with a new way to keep doing the same thing. And so, yes, when one understands that, that could be a cause for pessimism. White folks keep doing the same thing, which is making sure that they stay in power by whatever means necessary, to misquote Malcolm. But again, to go back to Gramsci, yes, you look at that situation and you say, this is fucked. What can I do? Like, there's no hope. That's what they want you to think,
Mm,
that there's no hope. And so you have to continue to go back to one of our earlier songs, fight the power.
mm,
You have to be, and again, going back to our conversation about socialism, there has not really been a truly socialist country that has existed, but you have to believe in the possibility. And so you have to keep fighting to make things better and to help make the dream a reality. And it might not, probably won't happen in your lifetime, but every little step that one makes to take things in the right direction and make things better, that is always a good thing. And so, whatever little area you are in, oh, this reminds me of something I meant to say a while back.
please.
No, um, the literary scholar and Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Mm,
once famously said, if I wanted to change the world, I would not get a PhD in English. And my response to that is exactly the opposite. I got a PhD in English precisely because I believe that by having a PhD in English and being a college professor, that is my way of contributing to the revolution and helping to put students out there in the world who are going to not just care about the capitalist economy, but who are going to take their educational skills and use them to help make the world a better place.
somehow that section made me think about Sting and the Police, Scooby-Doo, and I think, did Michelle Alexander go to Stanford also?
I don't know.
Okay. Anyway, but here's what my response to that, which is I totally agree. And firstly, like you said, those at the top want us to think that changing the system and making things better is impossible, so that we give up. So first of all, fuck them, right? I'm gonna die trying no matter what. And also, again, and I know because I've been talking to people since this election, if you are one of these people, especially if you're a white person, first of all, stop. You have so much agency. You're a white person, you're American. Stop. Start, you know, cry for a couple more days, couple more weeks if you need to, then cut it out and start thinking about how we can change this shit. And the thing I'd leave you with is it was not so long ago when when millions of people in this country were forced into chattel slavery. If you're a woman, that you are going to be raped and then forced to carry children who are then also born into bondage, right? Makes me think of The Color Purple, that the decisions to commit infanticide rather than bringing children into this world is just so, so intense. So if you are
That's the
not,
story of Toni Morrison's Beloved about, killing your children rather than having them become slaves.
that's my bad. I mixed it up. Not The Color Purple, but Beloved. Thank you for that correction there. If you are not currently living in Gaza or the West Bank or in severe poverty, then you have power in this world, right? Again, it was not that long ago when people were living in slavery and it took people doing crazy shit, right? Just have, not knowing, imagine not knowing where anything is a football field outside of where you live, right? That's how Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad got started. That people just had to run. They just got out and they went one direction. I think north because they knew like they had heard that the north was the place. But you're just looking at the stars and just running north, and that's of course why Frederick Douglass's paper was called the North Star, right? That you find the
Correct.
brightest star in the sky and you go that way. And you were going to get, most people got caught, right? So you got attacked and fucked up by dogs. You then got put in the hot box or whipped or lynched. You probably were hoping that they'd kill you at that point, because if not, they made an example of you and showed you better not try and run. Look at this person. We're literally starving them to death to show you what happens if you try and escape. And yet, these people escaped. They figured it out. Harriet Tubman figured out this shit and helped Black people in this country and this world escape slavery. And now, you know, all we got to do is figure out how to make Elon and Bill Gates and those fuckers pay their fair share. Come on, we can do that.
Shouldn't be hard.
And with that, it has come to be that time. I hope that you learned a thing or two and something in this episode caused you to smile. In the words of Derek Bell, courage is a decision you make to act in a way that works through your own fear for the greater good, as opposed to pure self-interest. Courage means putting at risk your immediate self-interest for what you believe is right. And our song of the day, I actually want to give a shout out to this artist. Her name is R.W.A, which is, first of all, special to me because my late grandmother, your mother, went by Yaya to me. And so an artist named R.W.A already touches my heart. But R.W.A is a really cool artist. She just recently put out a Tiny Desk, so she's starting to blow up. And despite the pressures of being in the entertainment industry and trying to make a name for yourself, she is extremely active politically. She's very outspoken when it comes to Palestine. And the song I'm picking for the show, because it's just a really great song, it always makes me dance. It's called All Right. I want to say a quote from R.W.A from a different song that's called Reprise. And the quote is, "What would I know? Who would I be if I had not been who I needed to be?" And that just makes me think about all of these people who have given their lives, have been killed in order to stand for something greater. And that is why I continue to be an optimist. I cannot give up when I know how many millions of people are dying unnecessarily at the hands of this system. And that's what we're going to call it today. So for Jesse and Pancho, thank you again for joining us on Radicals with Age, and we will see you after a while.